We are live on LinkedIn and YouTube. Our topic today is beginning of the end of wind power. And this is Professor Cleveland Jones, is his LinkedIn page. So a researcher and a consultant. Welcome, Professor Cleveland.
Great to be with you again this afternoon on a topic that might scare some people and say you're crazy, but hey, we have to talk about everything, right?
Yeah, people may be angry with you, but it's part of the
Yeah.
game, including Greta, because
I don't want to be on the wrong side of Greta, but you know, Cavagna, the funny thing is that this is when you say anything against any of the renewables, everybody thinks, oh, you're against all renewables. You know me. I believe in technology. I believe some renewables will have a
yeah,
place.
you're
And
right.
I specifically wanted to talk about wind because I think wind is in a very precarious situation, different than solar, than biofuels, and a lot of others.
These statements are very important because we are not against renewables.
Exactly.
No, we are trying to bring reality to people to think and to discuss things like that.
Exactly. It's not a question of believing in or not believing. It's not a religion. We have to analyze, the fundamentals, the
Perfect.
challenges, and if there are solutions to make, for example, certain renewable or sustainable energies take off, great. We'll try to implement them. But we have to be realistic and look at the fundamentals. And this is one of the things I've been doing, and it's not a very encouraging situation.
Perfect. Perfect. I know that you have some slides and are in your control. Please go ahead with
Yeah,
your. I will
let,
interrupt you, several
sure.
times, but
Yeah, let me add some of these sides. This is not a new slide. It talks a little bit about some of the historical costs that have come down for a lot of renewable energies. Of course, everybody knows solar got very cheap, even concentrating solar power, and even wind um, had significant cost reductions, but from very high levels, and especially offshore wind, which was more expensive, even though everybody thought that it had great potential. But one of the things that happens is that with solar, we're on a downhill curve that looks like it has a lot more downside. So costs could come down, and they're already incredibly cheap. It's not the case with wind. Wind is not decreasing costs anymore. In fact, we see a different trend beginning to appear. Costs are leveling out, and this is it's not scary because this is what happens. Some things have built-in materials costs, logistics, and so on that make it very difficult. So the more,
Professor Cleveland, could you please go back to the
yeah,
previous slides? Because I would like to understand a little bit more the details about this graphic. What does it mean,
what
this
okay, so you see, for example, in the middle you have the two orange things, graphs showing the great reduction in solar photovoltaic costs, which are solar panels, which are taking over the world. And indeed, we've spoken many times, and I've said, look, China is inundating the world with solar panels, dirt
uh-huh.
cheap, and they're even financing them for many countries that can't afford them, like Africa and Southeast Asia. So rather than complaining and saying, "Oh, China is dumping solar panels on us," hey, use them. They're dirt cheap. This is
Yeah.
a way for the rest of the world to implement solar on a very inexpensive basis because China
And
is doing that.
which curve is related to wind costs
Okay,
that I
so
cannot see?
on the right, you see the gray
Uh-huh.
blocks. They show relatively smoother cost decrease curve. It's not so
Uh,
sharp, and this is key because
okay.
in many of the production technologies and implementation technologies, we saw fantastic exponential drops in cost, and
Okay.
they're happening this is what happened to solar. It's just so cheap that it's competing with coal in many places. Now we look at we look at wind, and we see yes, costs came down, but they didn't come down so drastically,
So
and they're
drastically,
not
yeah.
coming down so drastically now. So
I
if
got it.
we see that cost reduction is petering out and it's not going to bring us down to the lowest levels, that is a problem because renewables have to be competitive. They
But it's a
will,
problem.
yeah.
It's only a problem of costs or different variables.
Oh, okay, I wanted to bring up cost first because I believe very much that
Okay.
renewables have to be competitive on a cost basis. They will
Hmm.
not get implemented solely because people think, oh, we have to go renewable, forget fossil fuels. Yeah, maybe a couple of European countries might do that, but the rest of the world will not go into renewables unless they are competitive. And
Perfect.
certainly, solar is being competitive. Some other energies are getting there, and some are not. So we have
Mhm.
to, separate things out. And indeed, like I was just chatting, if you look at another type of cost curve, we see that specifically wind turbines, which are the heart of the wind energy generation, they have begun reversing their cost
Wow.
reductions.
Really?
Sure, rotor blades way at the bottom, that's not the biggest part of the cost. Gearboxes, yeah, they're going up because a lot of components in gearboxes, materials, and so on are going up. So that trend is not positive. The generator is basically a motor inverse. That's more or less stable. It's not dropping tremendously. And in the most critical component, which is the wind turbine itself, the biggest part of the cost, you see a reversal of cost reductions because the wind turbine is what uses a lot of the critical materials that are beginning to be in short supply, or at least their prices are going up because people fear short supplies. I've been on
So,
record as saying that some of the critical minerals, they're not going to skyrocket in price as
yeah.
people think
And,
because,
and from 2020, the price returned to increase again. So that's the
exactly.
point.
So it's very important because everybody is assuming that some of these renewables are going to get cheaper and cheaper, just like solar. No, solar
Oh,
is a different animal. And we should be very thankful that solar is a different animal because we have at least one renewable energy, which is
perfect.
pretty competitive, and China's making it competitive for the rest of the world. But we do not have the ability to compare
And,
solar trends and wind trends. They are
uh
not
and, and
comparable.
and solar has less parts related to wind. Wind has some
Exactly.
different
Yeah,
rotating process, and
exactly.
so
It
solar is
it does
stable.
have critical
So plates.
minerals, but China dominates that industry, so it can throw those minerals into the solar panels, and that's part of what it sells. But in wind turbines, it just can't do that because it's not just that it has the critical minerals, it does, even for the magnets inside and so on, but those costs have gone up. So anytime that you have a reversal of costs, when everybody thinks that the costs are going to continue to go down, the result is a quite sharp reassessment of forecasts. Because forecasts, if you look 5, 10 years ahead, you say, oh, gee, wind is going to grow tremendously because you assume costs are going to come down increasingly constantly. But if that reverses, hey, the curves that you're talking about completely reverse. And that is the critical aspect in terms of cost. So we do have to recognize that we cannot make blind comparisons. Oh, wind energy, just like solar, costs are coming down. No, they came down in the past, some, but they are not coming down like solar, and they will not
Mhm,
come down like solar. So
mhm.
this is a real reality check, and it's a
Okay,
shock to many people because many
very
people
good.
blindly assuming that this was the case, and you can see why because many of the critical minerals, sure, back in 22, they spiked to tremendous levels. And you and I have been on a program where I said, the best solution to high prices is high prices. And indeed, when you have those high prices, reality comes in. People try to be much more conservative in how they use these minerals. They use less of each mineral. They find alternatives to some of the more expensive and least
And,
available minerals.
and these minerals are used for wind
For
turbines and
turbines, in particular, the magnets
turbine.
and the turbines. So it's also a question of availability. Although I don't believe that availability will be the issue that says, oh, we can't develop any more wind or solar or anything else because there's no minerals available. No, that's not going to happen. We could have slightly higher prices.
And,
This,
uh,
yeah,
and this curve shows exactly this is what you are trying to say.
yeah,
Let's say
but
manganese, for instance, had a peak in January 2022, but
yeah.
now is in a good level.
Exactly. And this is the thing. People were talking about rare earth minerals, which are indeed very important because even though they're abundant in the world, they're very concentrated in occurrence, and China has a dominant position. But even there, if you have costs that went up and now they came down a little bit, people have learned to use less of each and so on. They've also got the cost for wind and PV. No, we're talking just generating costs, Camaya. This is just to make the
Okay,
turbines.
not to storage.
No storage, just to make the blades, which is not no critical elements there. But it's important to realize that the cost went up, then they came down. They're still high, and in
Perfect.
some cases, some products can be high. For example, molybdenum is very high. Hey, I believe that it will go down. It's a short-term spike, and this happens to a lot of these minerals that are not produced in giant quantities, like aluminum, steel, and all these kinds of things. So they're
Mhm.
very prone to volatility. But ultimately, the market works. If you have high prices, people learn to consume a little bit less by using technology, alternatives, and so on. And also, you stimulate some production which might come in, even if it is side production from other minerals, like you
You,
produce copper or tin, and you also produce some of
so,
these
so
minerals.
what you mean is that a wind problem is not concentrated on the minerals, critical minerals.
No, it's not. The critical minerals are not the source of the problem. It's part of the problem
Okay.
because indeed, they consume a lot of critical minerals, and you can't still. We haven't learned to make a turbine that basically is just copper and steel and so on. Yeah, you need fancy minerals, but it is part of a problem. And we have to understand all of these things working together can make quite a difference. One of the other important things is that the industry that produces wind turbines and the industry that produces solar panels have looked at their historical cost reductions, and it doesn't seem so evident, but you can see that um, solar on the left has fallen, and it can fall a lot further, way down into the 20 per megawatt. That works out to 2 cents per kilowatt hour. That is very cheap if we get there, but it is possible. With with wind, it is not very likely that we can come down much below 3 cents a kilowatt hour is very cheap, but that is optimistic. The fastest approach, and the fastest is not likely to be the realistic.
How do we compare these two energy sources, solar and wind, with nuclear, coal?
Yeah,
Can Do you
yeah.
have something to say about that?
I don't have graphs here, but I can tell you, coal doesn't have these things because it was always so dirt cheap that it didn't need to do anything differently.
Uh-huh.
The only part of coal that went up drastically is the abatement costs. If you have a coal plant and it's spewing out horrible pollution, not emissions of CO2, pollution, you need to have precipitators and so on. If you add that cost in, solar coal is not that cheap anymore. So that is a problem. And in China, for example, which is running full steam ahead with coal because it has to, it has energy demand that can't be met otherwise unless they use a lot of coal. It has begun to do that because they have had very serious problems with pollution and health impacts. People were dying because of the pollution in the cities generated by coal plants. Not the emissions problem, not the climate change, not the the net zero. That's not their concern. They're concerned with pollution, so that made coal a little bit more expensive, or quite a bit more expensive if you start doing abatement. And then all of a sudden, solar is competitive. So they can use a lot of solar, and they have been implementing tremendous amount of solar, dirt cheap because they are world leaders in production and cost, lowest cost of production. But everything has a limit. They're doing as much as they can, but you have to understand their coal industry is tremendous and their coal use is tremendous. And then you have India, which is more or less on the same path. And India has even less money to spend on coal abatement. So it may not have as much resources to commit to solar, for example.
But what's the reason that countries are investing heavily in wind energy yet?
Well, I think in wind, where the projects are financed and they show a return that's based on forecasts of what their operating costs are, they are being implemented at the high end of the electricity production cost. But this is not competitive with nuclear, with hydro, and with other less expensive sources. So you can still implement some of these in certain places, and they may make economic sense, especially if there's incentives and the foreign capital investment and so on.
So the weak point is that there are subsidies in this.
There are, and there may be geographically, for example, the northeast of Brazil still has potential for wind energy, even offshore, but it is not something that's going to take over because that's a very limited opportunistic case. As long as European money is investing in wind there, it's going to be built. But now we have a problem because the forecasts have not been very realistic. Those forecasts were many times made with a 25-year lifetime of the turbines. And now we see that they're not going to last 25 years, maybe only 20. Now things are beginning to look a little different. And a lot of the optimistic forecasts of the operating expenses and in the history going forward have to be revised. That is a major problem. And when you start talking about decommissioning, the costs are very big. If you could delay those costs 5-10 years, okay, maybe you can swallow that, in 2035 or something. But if you have to swallow them in 2030, 2035, as opposed to 2040, that's going to be a big problem. And still, the decommissioning of blades and turbines can be handled because they're very compact and have solid metals in them. But the winter blades are a problem, and the decommissioning cost of all of this hasn't been worked out. It's just
These decommissioning costs are comparable to oil and gas because oil and gas has a very strong decommissioning cost.
Yes, but the oil and gas decommissioning costs have been well known and have been well estimated, and they're well taken into account. So I don't think that we're going to find big surprises in the decommissioning costs of most of the major fields that are in production that we know of today. The problem with decommissioning is surprises. At the big, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, oil and gas projects had decommissioning costs that were maybe a surprise
predictable.
back then. Yeah, and then people learn, hey, we have to take into consideration decommissioning costs, and they were understood, and they're now part of the projects. The problem with wind is that they have not been well assessed. People didn't
Okay.
really have a good understanding of how much it was going to cost and what they were going to do with blades and with the facilities themselves. So this is the problem when you have unexpected costs or unforecasted costs that all of a sudden come up, and they're advanced 5, 10 years from what you thought you were going to have to spend. Because some people were saying, "Oh, wind turbine will last there 30 years," and well, offshore wind is not going to last that long. Very harsh conditions offshore, and that's going to be a big problem as well.
Okay.
So these are contributing factors that make costs go up. Unexpected expenditures make projects less attractive. It can dry up investment, and investment capital is very quick to respond. If it sees that something begins to be a little bit more risky, zap, the faucet is turned off, no more money for wind, and then things can change very fast. Um, People say, "Oh, but we can repurpose a blade from the wind turbine, from the wind project into a shelter." Yeah, 10 meters of one, and we have 10,000 lying around. This is
Yeah.
no solution.
Allow me, please, Professor, to insert a comment from SRB
I,
about Euro.
yeah. Yeah, that's one line of thought, because people were using levelized costs, and now we say, how about energy in, energy out? That's another way. I think that the way the projects have to be considered is simply on a net present value, on an internal rate of return, and then the investors that are investing money in these projects will decide if, given all the costs that we know, including decommissioning and building and so on, if
Uh-huh.
they can make a decent internal rate of return, if
But
the project
considering
is good.
the total cost of the process, the end-to-end process, from minerals to rejections.
I agree, but it's investors who are going to drive the process. If investors can buy the materials necessary, can pay for the construction, and things aren't sustainable, it doesn't matter. The next project may have a
Next
problem,
project, okay.
but this one doesn't.
And the next
So
steps is a problem of the country, not the investors.
yes, so I think that it's important to recognize, if we don't artificially inflate any industry specifically, we have to be reasonable. We have to invest in research and development, but not say we have to put money into solar or wind. It's the market that has to decide that. If investors can make money building wind projects, great. But now they're realizing that they can't. They can still make money with solar. They can still expect to make money with geothermal, for example, unless they find surprises down the line. For now, it doesn't seem so. So they have to invest where they think they can make money. And this is what the market is there for. It's not, Congress of any one country or all countries shouldn't be able to decide, oh, you must invest in wind. Let the market decide, because the market can go into each specific project and say, hey, maybe in this location it does make sense, but in general it may not. So, and this is part of the problem with wind. There may still be several projects that make sense, but in general, the projects are becoming much less attractive. This is not a solution, repurposing blades or anything. This is not going to solve the decommissioning or the eventual disposal problem. And that's a big, expensive part of the whole project. The other part is, of course, anytime you have a failure like you had, last year with the typhoon in offshore projects, and the installations actually, were destroyed. That's bad image. Maybe, insurance will pay for it, but then what happens? The insurance industry will realize that wind is not so safe. So the insurance premiums go up, the cost for insurance goes up and the cost of the projects goes up.
Probably the insurance cost for wind is bigger than for solar, for instance.
Oh, of course. And now it's going up drastically because, for example, the projects up in the northeast of the U.S. where this wind turbine broke up and the blades started washing ashore. Okay, if we're realistic, that's not the end of the world. No one got killed. No whales got killed because a piece of the blade fell on them or anything. But the repercussions are bad. You see these pieces of winter blades floating into the beach. That's horrible. Everybody is up in arms about it, especially in a region that was very hesitant of wind in the first place because they said, well, we want it very far so we don't see it and so on. And now you see it on the beach and they have to go collecting pieces of wind blade. So bad image is bad, just like the oil industry went through that turbulence when disasters happened 20, 30 years ago, and they learned we have to put a lot of effort into reducing leaks and disasters to the point that they're almost inexistent because anyone is super serious, very expensive. So all of the prevention is worth it, but that increases cost. So wind projects have automatic built-in cost increases because of all of this. It's just reality. It's not an ideological thing.
And there's a point here because the wind systems are becoming taller, bigger every day.
Yeah, and you could say, oh, they're bigger, they're stronger. Well, the engineers designed them to be to withstand a category 3 or 4. What happens when there's a category 5 storm? That's what happens. So are we going to build them for a category 5? The cost will be astronomically higher. So this is a realization. Yeah. For example, in the North Sea, building some of the oil rigs there, of course, they have to be much stronger because there's giant waves and so on. Here in Brazil, in the offshore of the pre-salt, the conditions are much more amenable. You don't have to have such reinforced expensive costs for winterizing and withstanding 30-meter waves and so on. But this is the reality for wind, and even an image costs money, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the industry itself has grown a lot. There's approximately 1 terawatt of installations now, mostly in China, of course, many other countries. But it has grown, maybe not exponentially like for solar, but it grew. But now people take this and they just extrapolate it and say, oh, it's going to keep growing tremendously. The wind part of this is the offshore and the onshore gray areas at the top. And they just, tremendously growing from current levels. This is not realistic because anybody can just extrapolate a trend. You don't even need a degree for that. But if you don't consider the underlying factors that are driving this growth, you're absolutely on thin ice. This is nowhere realistic, absolutely impossible forecast. Up to 6 terawatt hours by 2050? No way. Even 2030, giant growth, no way. And then if you look just at the offshore wind, which is the major growth area because installations are bigger, winds are more constant. Yes, the operating conditions may be better for a more steady generation, but costs are higher. The problems cause costs to go up, and they still make forecasts that are untenable. From, you have to laugh. From 64 gigawatts to 2,000 terawatt. Someone had too much coffee or something else. This is not reasonable. It doesn't make sense given what we know about costs, about the installations, about even this is just probably looking at the potential of wind energy in terms of winds offshore. Yes, offshore winds are strong and so on, but so are wind currents. And people aren't estimating that because ocean current generation is expensive, wave energy is expensive. So it doesn't matter that nature has a tremendous source of energy out there. You just can't harness it economically. So these targets don't make any sense. Um, and then we have to say, anytime you start missing targets, if the industry says, oh, we're going to have 1 terawatt like we have now, we're going to go to 1.5 and so on, you start missing targets and the industry pays attention. And who pays attention? The investors. And as soon as they realize, hey, this is not going according to plan, they can turn off the faucet for the dollars going into those projects because there are other alternatives. People who invest in wind energy have many alternatives. They can invest in solar, they can invest in batteries, they can invest in geothermal. And if they see that wind,
Yeah, but these alternatives sometimes are not available in the regions they are trying to make energy to.
I would say that most of the large projects, the investment dollars available probably are. And where they're not, I agree with you. But are you going to put money into wind just
Yeah.
because there's no alternatives there and knowing that
Okay.
you could lose money? No, you're going to
Okay.
go think of something else, even
Yeah.
if it's a gas turbine
Yeah,
for
gas
backup
turbine
power.
or nuclear or things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, nuclear probably takes a lot of courage and maybe the big pockets in investors because wind energy projects can be small. We're talking
Yeah.
small. $200-300 million is small. Nuclear energy, we're talking billions. So in this universe of the investment community, there are many alternatives because at less expensive projects like this, there are many alternatives, even
Okay.
bioenergy and so on. So this is the real danger to wind energy. Miss targets, the realization that looking ahead, we can't just extrapolate. That's going to make a big difference. And come on, as a conclusion, I have a graph that I suggest as my prediction of,
Very
people
good.
don't want to look at a bump like this. They just want to look at lines going up.
Greta will love you.
Okay,
Yeah.
I will take my
But
lumps.
on this graph, do you believe so? In a reduction of, I know it's not. It's much more than a reduction. It's the
But yeah,
end of wind
yeah.
energy.
But you know why? Because we have right now, for example, a terawatt of wind. Those projects are going to continue producing energy for 15, 20 years maybe. But from 2023, you add 15, 20 years, those projects are going to come to the end of their life. And if they're not substituted, like I'm saying that they're not likely to be substituted, we're going to have a net reduction in installed capacity. So from maybe we have still a little bit of momentum, maybe for the next
Okay,
2 or 3 years. China's still going to put some money into it.
I
Okay.
got.
But, from then on, it's going to be a race because the decommissioning of projects is going to accelerate and new projects are going to be very few and selective. So we're going to have a net reduction. And this is my best case. I think that we could reduce even more.
Mhm.
And it's possible maybe the reduction might be slower if some countries decide that they can
Very
work.
clear. Very clear thoughts. Yeah, yeah, it's clear.
But
It's
but
clear. So
that's my feeling.
yeah, no, it's important because you predict that will be a reduction, and
Yeah.
the proportion of the total wind energy compared to others will be
Oh,
smaller.
will go down because people were assuming that wind and solar would be more or less equal at 2030, even 2050. This just destroys that completely because if solar can get to 10 and even more percent, wind will, given this graph, wind won't make it to 2% because in relative terms, when solar is expected to grow so much and other renewables, this is going to
Yeah.
make wind much less significant. This is what I think classifies as the beginning of the end of wind.
Okay, very clear. Let me go to the conclusions, and I have a joke for you, of course.
All
It
right,
seems
let's
that
see.
you love solar and hate wind.
Okay, I'm sorry, Greta. You're trying, but not on this score.
It's not the game. Yeah, but what was the last chart was very clear,
Yeah.
very clear.
Of course, like I've always said on your programs, my forecasts out 5, 10 years. Come after me after 5 and 10 years if I'm wrong, But this is
Yeah,
what I believe.
we can check in 10 years. Of course, we will
Okay,
be here.
I'll maybe if I'm here, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Take care, Kavai. It was
Great
fun.
conversation today. Thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Bye bye.